The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
You're now about to witness the truth.
It's the Benjamin Dixon Show.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Benjamin Dixon Show. I am your host, Benjamin Dixon. It is Thursday, January 25th, 2018. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, I'd like to thank our patrons who make this possible. Without you, it is not at all possible. So a lot on the docket this morning, pun intended. Oh, make sure that that's not showing because they definitely are not a sponsor of this show. I want to get into the case of Larry Nassar, who sexually assaulted pled guilty to sexually assaulting 150 girls. The Olympic doctor who got away with it for years until he didn't. And it's not really a question of what he did because he's already pled guilty to that. But it's a question of whether or not the judge in the case, who at sentencing said what so many people were feeling. And, you know, we cheered and, you know, people cried. And whether or not what she said went too far. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, you already know where I stand on this. I generally, there's no use beating around the bush. I like to expose my biases up front. I generally have zero remorse. This is the place where I am not the person who's going to take the higher road. Generally, when you have someone as disgusting as this, who has hurt so many people intentionally for so long, and I already hear the counter arguments. So, save your counter arguments. You can give them, but realize I already know every argument that's going to be made against what I'm getting ready to say. I generally fall on the side of I don't believe in state executions, state-sponsored executions, but short of that, I do not care about this type of individual. The only thing I wouldn't want to see done would be the death penalty in almost every single case. I'm even of the opinion that I don't want the shooter from South Carolina who killed 9 people at Mother Emanuel AME. I don't want him. I can't even remember his name. And it's good. I don't want to remember his name. I don't want him to get the death penalty. So short of the death penalty, I really don't care. Sentence him to life. And the only question in this conversation is about whether or not the judge in the case went too far. Some are describing it as grandstanding. And so I want to discuss that. I don't want to go any further because that's just a prelude to a conversation. I'll be reading your comments from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, as always. I also want to discuss Bank of America's profiting on poverty. This is absolutely nothing new. But what's new about it is that the angle that I want to discuss it from is the extent. How many people are actually living the life that Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and these other large banking institutions can make billions of dollars off of our poverty? And I think if we ever really pause and put into perspective how many Americans are actually living like this and get beyond the stigma of being embarrassed about it because it's institutionalized, if we move past that, then we can see the strength in numbers that we completely outnumber poverty is so prevalent in the United States. Living paycheck to paycheck is so prevalent in the United States that there's a good chance that there's probably less than 1% of America who has not experienced what Bank of America is doing to the poorest Americans, as well as those Americans who look good on paper. Their income says that they're living good, but in actuality, they're living paycheck to paycheck. And then last but not least, a brief conversation on race and class that's brought up by Pastor Mark Burns, one of Donald Trump's black preachers. I can say that because there's only like three black preachers in the entire America who love Donald Trump so much that they would embarrass themselves like Mark Burns has. But he brought it up on Twitter, and I want to discuss that tweet very briefly. So again, I'll read your comments in the comment section on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and get your input, and we'll take it from there. All right, let's get to the case of Larry Nassar. He sexually assaulted 150 girls, and at his sentencing, the judge in the case, the federal judge, really did not hold back. And the question is whether or not Judge Rosemarie Aquilina, I know I said that wrong, but forgive me, whether or not she went too far. And the underlying conversation is clearly the conversation that I want to have of where's the threshold? At what point do we have to be so civil to the point where we can't be petty? Honestly, that's what it is. Like if I dispense with all the pretense and trying to make this sound like it's an intellectual, philosophical conversation, to an extent it is, but to another extent, you gotta. I personally have no problem embracing my inner pettiness, especially when it's about an issue so serious, about crimes as serious. So federal judge Aquilina said a couple of things, and I want to read some of her quotes and get your opinion as well as give mine as to whether or not she went too far. Let's see. Let's start with the most egregious. Let's start with the most egregious, the one about the Constitution, whether if it were not for the Constitution prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment. I want to read the exact statement, and here's what she said. Our Constitution does not allow for cruel and unusual punishment. If it did, I have to say, I might allow what he did to all of these beautiful souls, these young women in their childhood. I would allow someone or many people to do to him what he did to others. And this seems to be the statement that has sent a lot of people into the category of she went too far. A lot of people have described it, and when I say a lot of people, of course, these conversations happen on Twitter, and that's a significant place because this is where you can hear the voices of media figures, people who have large enough platforms to where what they say is significant. Take Matt Iglesias of Vox.com. He's in the category, tweeting earlier yesterday that essentially that her grandstanding was too much. As much as he despised the person of Larry Nassar, he feels that the judge went too far. And so there are quite a few people who are falling into that category. I'm of the opposite opinion. I think it was just right. I think that she voiced the concerns, the anger of so many families and real victims who suffered at the hands of this man for years, whose lives are forever changed. And okay. Before I even go, I'm trying to pace myself because I definitely have a bias in this, right? I definitely have an opinion in this that is not above the fray. It's not the high road, right? And I'm okay with that. And I think that sometimes that we fight so hard to be the better people that we become what Brandon Sutton of the Discourse said, that we become recklessly civil, right? It's reckless civility. And in this case, I mean, it is jaw-dropping to hear a judge say things like, if it wasn't for the Constitution, I would do this to you. If it wasn't for the Constitution, I would essentially let a bunch of people rape you. And then she went on to say that, we can't give you the death penalty in here, but I'm essentially signing your death warrant. He got 40 to 175 years in this case. I mean, she was going, and she became, in that moment, the voice of so many people. And I think the question is this, is that at the point of sentencing, and this is probably a legitimate, this is a legal question, right? This is probably a constitutional question, a legal question, but I'm going to pose it here in this just conversation that we're having. Is there a difference in the responsibility for the judge in sentencing, in their statements at sentencing, versus their responsibility during the trial? Now, granted, there was no trial here because he pled guilty. Right? But the judge did allow, I believe, some 145 statements to be read in this hearing. And so, but does the responsibility of the judge differ? And I'm sure that there's some legal scholars or some attorneys or some judges in the audience who will very quickly have the answer to that. I don't have the answer to that. In fact, I didn't pose the question until 5 seconds ago. It didn't drop into my head until 5 seconds ago. And again, let me get this off screen because they definitely do not sponsor us. Because if it is, then if there is a difference, then there seems to be, oftentimes, I've seen judges serve in the role of the voice of the victims at sentencing. And I've seen this many, many, many occasions. And if this judge, this federal judge in this case, who is serving in this capacity, serving in the role of the voice of the victim in issuing out justice, the trial has been finished, the evidence has been presented, she presided over a fair trial, which is not the case in this because it was a guilty plea. But let's just put it into context. If her role, if a judge's role is different in sentencing than it is during the trial, then this makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense for a judge to become the voice of the victim because I think that they actually, in many occasions, do that and have done that. And from that perspective, then I would say concretely that I see nothing wrong with what she said, because if she's speaking on behalf of the voice of the victims, right, in this sentencing, because the trial phase is over and she's served as a fair adjudicator in this matter, then I see nothing wrong. I will say that someone tweeted me this morning, and I think they made a wonderful point that I will agree with, and actually I will try to find that tweet so I don't just have to paraphrase, because I think this would be the only place that I would give a criticism. And this is from Esteban Hayes on Twitter this morning. They said, I also wouldn't say she was grandstanding. I would not say that she was grandstanding. I will say that the judge was unwise in that moment. And I think that's the perfect way to describe this, because, I mean, I only gave you 2 statements out of, I don't know, a 15-minute statement of what she said. And a lot of it was just as intense as these other statements. These 2 statements that I gave you, though, were like the apex. They were the crown jewel of her statement. And, you know, I would say that in this case, it is unwise in any case to give ammunition to your opponents, or in this case, I think more specifically, to undermine to potentially, even remotely undermine the potential of actually getting justice in a particular case. I would say that that is unwise. However, it's not incumbent upon us to be the biggest person all the time. And I think that's the crux of what I want to say this morning. It's not, I'm tired. I'm personally tired of being the bigger person, right? We don't always have to be the more magnanimous. We're not living in a civil time, right? We're not living in a time, and of course, I'm mixing stories, I'm mixing issues, I'm speaking more politically now than I am about the specific case, but for me, it's the same thing. For me, it's the same thing. At some point, people have the right to just let how they feel out. And if you don't like it, if you think it's unwise, that's fine. If you disagree with it, that's fine. But it doesn't make how they feel any less relevant or significant. And so many of us have to bottle up what we're feeling. We have to pick every word to be precise. We have to be extremely fastidious with our word choice. We have to make sure that we dot every I and cross every T. We have to make sure that we never raise our voice above a certain level. We have to compartmentalize every aspect of our anger and our emotions. And I'm just done doing that. And it's unhealthy to do that. And I don't think that we live in a society where always trying to be the bigger person is useful, period. I can end the statement there. It is not useful to always try to be the more magnanimous person. And in my saying that, I recognize that it is not a magnanimous statement to say, right? But sometimes, I mean, for the love of God, sometimes people have the right and the need, and the moment calls for you to not try to take the high road. I hear Michelle Obama in my ear saying, when they go low, we go high. And I'm personally, if you watch me for any significant amount of time, you realize that as high of a road as I try to take 9 times out of 10, I will try to take that high road. But there's going to be that 1 out of 10 occasion, and these days it's really like 2 out of 10. 20% of the time, I'm going to cut as low, if not lower, as our opponent, because the times don't call for us to always be civil. And I know this is not apples to apples. The judge has a different responsibility, and I would, and because the question that I pose, I think is the only relevant question in terms of substance, the question of whether or not this judge has a responsibility different in sentencing and in her statement at sentencing than she did during the trial. I will pursue that question. I didn't get that question in my head until we started the show. I will pursue the answer to that question from a legal standpoint, and I will talk to people about that and bring that back to you, right? So I know what I'm saying is not apples to apples, but I am taking this to, I'm extrapolating from this to make a point about life, to make a point about politics, to make a point about our culture right now, to make a point about black issues, about race issues, about political issues, about economic issues. We don't have the responsibility of always being the good and the bigger person. We don't. And then sometimes when we try to always be that more magnanimous person, we become a useful tool for people who know how to capitalize and monopolize on our desire to be the bigger person. And we become our own worst enemy by trying to always take the high road. If I were to make a cultural comparison, it would be from Star Wars. Oh, imagine that. It would be from Star Wars. I actually didn't plan this whatsoever. For people listening to the podcast, I just revealed my Star Wars shirt underneath the sweater. It would be Star Wars, and I'm not the biggest Star Wars fan. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I don't know everyone's name. So as I filibuster, I'm going to look up the name of this particular Jedi, and I think that his case, Samuel Jackson. Jedi name. So in this case, it is Mace Windu. I knew I could find it. So Mace Windu was the Jedi master who was closest to utilizing the dark side without ever going into the dark side. And there is a threshold. This is cultural. I mean, this is just, you know, I'm just trying to give you a comparison, right? It's relevant in the sense that sometimes you have to tread in the dark arts. Sometimes you have to go to look to the edge of the abyss, right? You have to go to the edge of the abyss and realize that there are things in there that you're going to have to use to fight back against the monsters that surround you. And then hopefully that abyss doesn't consume you. Generally it does. And I mean, so be it. But sometimes some people are going to have to fight the dirty fights, right? You're going to have to fight the dirty fights. Everybody is not up for it. Everybody's not willing to do it. But I mean, look at where we are right now in society. Look at who the president of the United States is. Do you honestly believe that we're going to be able to win and beat Donald Trump in 2020 if we get a candidate that's just kind, a candidate that is magnanimous, a candidate who is above the fray, a candidate who is incapable of mixing it up with Donald Trump in the dark arts, in the dark side? Do you think that society right now will benefit from someone who won't push the envelope and tread in an arena? Yes, my microphone acts crazy. And if this continues, I will have to switch microphones and take a break. But do you think that the society actually would benefit from someone who is more concerned with being civil than they are fighting Donald Trump right where he is? And I'm telling you, and this is a far extrapolation from the original story, but the underlying current is the same. The underlying message is the truth, with the exception of whether or not that judge has a responsibility in sentencing, that she may have violated the responsibility in sentencing. However, if the judge has the liberty to speak for the voice of the victims in sentencing, then I see absolutely no problem with what she did. I feel it is a long extrapolation from that point, but the undercurrent is the same. And it is simply this. We're not at a time in society where we can be civil all of the time. Very simply put. All right. Moving on. Bank of America. Bank of America, by now everybody should absolutely know what Bank of America is doing with their new requirements for you to have a $1,500 balance or a $250 a month direct deposit, or you will be fined $12 a month to maintain an account with them. And yesterday on Like It or Not, I explained that it really isn't about that $12 a month at all. Let's start there. It is absolutely not about the $12 a month, because that is nothing compared to what Bank of America is able to get from the poorest people in society, people who are living on the edge. People, it's funny. There are levels to living on the edge. And at certain levels, I don't care. Like if you're making millions of dollars a year and you're living on the edge because you're consuming millions of dollars a year, I personally don't care to include you in this conversation. But a person who's making $15,000 a year and is living off of $20,000 a year, they're living clearly on the edge. And a person who's making $45,000 a year and they're living, and it costs $60,000 a year for them to live, they're clearly living on the edge. They're two distinctly different types of living on the edge. Right? There's a separation between it. I would compare it to living in poverty in Boston versus living in poverty in Atlanta. Living paycheck to paycheck in Boston rather versus living paycheck to paycheck in Atlanta. Right? Living paycheck to paycheck in Boston might have you in some really bad situations, some really bad neighborhoods. Some, you're not really, it's sketchy. Living paycheck to paycheck at $45,000 a year in Atlanta, as I look around and survey the land, it's like, it's a better living. But so there's a qualitative difference based on your income and on your location. However, the truth is the same. Whether you're making $45,000 a year and you're living edge to edge, check to check, or you're making $15,000 a year and you're living check to check, the banking industry is designed to make a profit off of all of us. Anyone that they can trap in the vicious cycle of overdraft fees. This has nothing to do with $12 a month. Nothing whatsoever, because that's a pittance compared to what they can get out of people living check to check, what they can get out of you vis-a-vis overdraft fees. $35 a pop. We were talking to callers yesterday on the 4 o'clock show, and one caller called in and spoke of how in one pay period, he had $175 of overdraft fees. And listen, the stigma around it is most people don't even want to admit that they're living that life. Most people don't want to admit that they're living in an existence where they're looked down upon and said, and people are saying that you don't manage your money right, or you're poor in general. Most people don't want to admit that they're poor. Matter of fact, for the people in the radio audience, I'm just making gestures as, look at me. Well, that's all I'll say. It's a reality that most people don't want to admit, because we're living in a society where you have to give the appearance of success all the time. No matter how poor you're living, you have to give the appearance of success, because that's encoded in our system. That is a mechanism to keep us trapped in this system, because if poor people and people living check to check and people living on the edge, no matter whether they're making $15,000 a year, $0 a year, or they're making $45,000 a year living check to check, if all the people realize how many other people are living that same exact existence, there would be a real revolution in the streets. And so part of the mechanism that keeps us from ever actually realizing how many people are living that existence is the shame, it's the stigma, it's the unwillingness to actually be the first to say that I am living in poverty and I'm living check to check and my situation is bad, and that this situation with Bank of America is perfectly designed to not get $12 a month out of me, but to get $200 a month out of me. Or no, I'm sorry, $175 per pay period. And that's precisely how we as the working class contribute to maintaining this system that exploits the working class. Nobody wants to tell you, the other person, that we're poor. And if people in the working class, and I know everybody in my audience that's listening to me is not necessarily poor. I have some really successful listeners. That's the only way I actually do the show, because I have listeners who actually can send significant checks every single month to make sure that we keep having these conversations. So I'm not trying to draw a distinction and a separation or put a wedge between the poorest in my audience and the people who are doing well, because the people who are doing well are be the ones who fund the revolution. But I am saying that it's time for us to start looking around to each other and realizing that we're not in this alone. Not only are we not in this alone, but we are in the vast majority. This is how the overdraft industry can become a billion-dollar industry. This is how banks, this is how they make money off of people who can't leave money in their banks for any significant time enough for the bank to actually loan it out and to make a profit off of it. Banks ostensibly make their money off of loaning the money that other people deposit. And if you're living check to check, you absolutely can't leave money in your account for more than one pay period. Matter of fact, how many of you in my audience actually have the experience of, as soon as you get the check, the next day it's gone? If not the day you get the check, it's gone. And that is the real reality of being in the working class, being in the lower middle class, and just making enough to get by. And yet we're ashamed to actually say it to each other. And so we really are living in a closeted society that of poverty, of poorness, because we are ashamed, because everybody on Facebook has to make sure that they look like they're making good money and that they're living their best life, and that everything is glorious and everything's fine. Everybody on Instagram has to show that how they're balling out of control. And this is quite literally how you become a millionaire, and then before you know it, you spend everything and you're right back down to poverty, because we have a keeping up with the Jones mentality that has been baked into our system, and it's such a useful tool for maintaining this system. And if we ever shake that stigma and we ever start, and perhaps we have to start with comedy and actually laughing about it for not crying. But if we ever start sharing the depth of the extent, if we ever start sharing the extent of poverty and living check to check and living in the overdraft life and having banks make billions of dollars off of you because you were in the overdraft last pay period. They hit you for $200 last pay period, and now you're in the overdraft again for the exact $200. So that means if they had not hit you with $200 of overdraft fees, then you wouldn't be in the overdraft this pay period. Talk to me, somebody. I'm like, I know Americans are living that life. How many Americans are? And that's the question. And that's a question that we probably won't get the answer to without a lot of research and actually removing the stigma, so people will admit to the fact that they're living an existence in which the banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and the rest of them are able to profit off of our poverty, profit off of our pain, specifically with the useful tool of overdraft fees. Let alone the entire system, right? This is not neglecting to talk about how the entire system is designed to make billions of dollars to get our last dollar. That's notwithstanding. The overdraft fee industry is a relatively new phenomenon in capitalism. And this is an addition to capitalism that is so punitive, specifically to people who have the least amount of money to spare, the least amount of room to make an error, right? Some people have enough money that if they make a financial mistake, they don't even notice it. But if you make a financial mistake, whether it's a $15 mistake, or maybe you got adventurous and you took your family out to get a $50 meal, shame on you for spending that $50, right? You got adventurous and now you're living in that life. You have no margin of error. No room for error. You cannot afford to make a $50 mistake. If you make a $50 mistake, that puts you in a vicious cycle where the banks are sitting there now waiting, because everything is electronic. There is no cash life anymore. There's no ability to live completely off without the debit cards that the banks generate. Everything about your life has to be run through some type of electronic payment system. And that's where the entire industry, the entire capitalistic system is designed. I mean, we're talking about Russell Simmons yesterday, ponying off the rush card on black communities specifically, but all of America in general, and how these prepaid debit cards are designed to do the exact same thing that banking institutions do to you. So now you've been locked out of the banking institutions, and now you're in an institution, a secondary institution that's designed to do the same exact thing to you. And they're all there lined up waiting to profit off of perpetual poverty. Let's read some comments from the comment section. Pixie the Moon said, I get a monthly check, SSDI, and 2/3 of it goes to bills and rent. If I had a car, I'd have exactly no money every month. Pagan Bear said, after all the stories I've read about Bank of America, I can't believe anyone goes to them willingly. And the problem, I'm glad you brought that up, because the reality of it is this $12 a month fee is very similar to the fees that you get at other banks, right? There are very few commercial banks that are designed to actually take care of their customers. You really have to go to like a credit union, and then some of those are questionable. So it's not just Bank of America. I mean, one of our viewers yesterday at the 4 o'clock show, they shared with us their experience, and we'll have to dig into it, verify it, and try to get more information on it. But they shared as an anecdote their experience of trying to cash a check, a paper check at Walmart, and Walmart refusing to cash the check because they owed Wells Fargo money. And so it used to be a time where if you were living check to check and you were in the overdraft, et cetera, you get a paper check, take that paper check to a check cashing store. Don't ask me how I know, or you can't ask me how I know. Hell, we have to get rid of that stigma. But you take that check to a check cashing store and you cash it, and you're able to still live even though you owe the bank $150. But now they're closing that loop, according to the anecdote given to us yesterday, which I have not confirmed or researched, but it sounds plausible enough for me to share with you right now. You like how I cover my ass, huh? But now they've closed the loop and said, you're trying to cash this check at Walmart. We're not going to cash it until you pay Wells Fargo. And there's got to be a tipping point, right? There's got to be a tipping point where they're asking themselves the question, how far can we push this? How far can we push the working class and the lower middle class to the point, where is our breaking point? Where is our breaking point where we collectively say, to hell with all this, burn the entire system down? And we don't even have to do it through violence. We simply can do it by not complying or participating in the system. If all the poorest people in America refuse to operate in these banking systems and found a way somehow, see, we will find a way to survive without it. How many people have reduced their consumption to basic living, right? And of course, everything, I just had like 30 thoughts in my head. I'm going to put all of them to the side so I can finish that first thought. How many of us have cut out all the frivolousness, all the extra clothes, all the extra anything? What is a vacation? What the hell is that? How many of us have cut out, all we have are the basic things that we need to survive, which include things that used to be considered as a perk, but we can't survive without internet now. We can't have a job without the internet, right? So we have the basics of living: house, rent, food, and the internet, and phones. We've reduced our consumption, and that's because we had to learn to live with the money that we have in a system that's designed to rape us economically every single day. Likewise, if we found a way to live like that, then there's going to become a breaking point where more Americans say we absolutely can't afford to participate in this banking system. The question is, where is that threshold? Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and the rest of them have calculated that it's nowhere near right now. It's nowhere near the overdraft fiasco. Let's see. Let's read a couple more comments. I was told, this is from Pagan Bear, I was told one year that it would be better for me to do my own taxes instead of getting them done by quick return. And I think this is in response to the statement above it that they do the same exact thing with quick tax returns. Absolutely. Reading a lot of comments here. You should join in the conversation in the comment section because I think it's all for that fascinating. But if you take anything away from this, I would say let's all stop being ashamed of sharing our poverty experiences. And some, you know, as we talk about it, I remember a year ago, I asked my Twitter timeline to share their most embarrassing poverty moment. And I shared mine. Mine happened to be kind of cute because it involved me and my wife and dating my wife, but it was embarrassing. And then as we shared, my heart started to break at all the stories that like took my story, which was embarrassing, and multiplied it by 100-fold. And so there's pain in this poverty, there's grief, there's sadness, there's sorrow in this poverty, which is a part of some of the reason why we don't share these stories. But I honestly believe that in terms of actually making a difference, if we saw how many people are living this experience, one, we would start laughing about it in a therapeutic sense. We'd be like, oh, we're not alone. But then two, we could start scaring the absolute shit out of these institutions who are having a field day making a profit off of our poverty. All right. Last but not least, I didn't realize how late it was. Mark Burns he's only famous because Donald Trump likes him. And Donald Trump only likes him because he happens to be a black preacher who is willing to throw his support behind Donald Trump. And, you know, and I've said many occasions, the fastest way to notoriety and economic success, I'm not sure how much economic success this has translated into for Mark Burns, but definitely has translated into notoriety, a national platform, a national voice. The fastest way to get that is to be a black face who's willing to say the things that white people, particularly white conservatives, would never be able to get away with saying. Right. That being said, that's the individual that I'm referring to, Mark Burns. On Twitter, this is what he said yesterday, and I think it's a good jump-off point for one last conversation. He said, quote, "Racism isn't really about color." This is a black man speaking, a black preacher. "Racism has always been about the haves versus the have-nots, and President Donald Trump is raising the have-nots to the same level as the haves. In today's society, a poor white person gets treated the same as a poor black person." Now, on the surface of it, it seems plausible if you are immersed in a class critique that includes an analysis of racism, just a little, you know, it just surface value. You read it and be like, class and race. But then you read it twice, you'll be like, oh, this is not about class and race at all. This is about trying to neuter the argument that racism exists in the United States. And what better way to do that than to have a blackface to do the bidding of it? And then, of course, the line in there about, quote, "and President Donald Trump is raising the have-nots to the same level as the haves." It is extremely ridiculous to make that conclusion when you consider the real implications of the tax reform bill, which is literally putting billions, 1.5 trillion to be exact, into the hands of corporations and the richest people in America at the expense of programs that help the have-nots. So how can you help the have-nots when you're taking the money, literally taking money from the have-nots and giving it to the haves? So the absurdity and the ludicrousness of that, I had to pause and think, of that particular sentence really just undermines anything substantive that you could pull out of this tweet. And I'm trying to deal fairly with this tweet and not just call it rubbish, but actually let's consider what he's saying here and see what's good and what's not good. In today's society, this is the last part of the tweet. In today's society, a poor white person gets treated the same as a poor black person, end quote. No, that's not true. In today's society, poor white people have a hard time. I would say in today's society, economically, clearly, a white person has a harder time economically than a middle-class rich white person. And included in that are some systemic injustices. Yes. But to be sure, a poor white person, I believe, and I don't want to take credit for it, so I'm going to go to his timeline. Samuel, I cannot remember his last name, but he's giving some quick facts about the reality that poor white people actually can live in a middle-class black life experience. And if you keep going up, it's like a middle-class white American are able to afford and are given opportunities to live like a wealthy black person. So there's clear evidence to suggest that this idea that there's some type of equality because of poverty is quickly undermined by the actual data, right? The spirit of it is something that we talk about on this. No. Actually, I have to correct myself. Not the spirit of it. But what a person like me would read initially would say that there is something to the idea of class solidarity that we need to expand on a whole lot more. But I've been around the block long enough to understand that this tweet is utter garbage, right? Number one. And number two, that this tweet is very intentional in trying to undermine the cause of anti-racism, the cause of the civil rights, the cause of Black Lives Matter, the cause of actual equality. This tweet is uniquely designed to undermine that. And number three, it's really just something to service the person who's making Mark Burns famous, which is Donald Trump, which is to draw this extremely fallacious conclusion that Donald Trump is doing something that is bringing up the have-nots to the haves. It's almost so absurd that we shouldn't even talk about it. However, this guy's platform and the size that it's grown to because of Donald Trump actually warrants us to have this conversation, because how many people are going to believe this lie? The 3 lies in one tweet. How many people are going to actually say, that's right? I mean, of course, you know, the more skeptical in my audience would say only idiots would believe it. And I would say then how many idiots are in America? Enough to elect Donald Trump. But I digress. Samuel Sinyangwe, I'm sure I brutalized that last name. This is what he said. Poor white families have 150 times more wealth than poor black families. And whites who have never been to college have more wealth than blacks with a college degree. Racism is about race. I mean, you can't look at those numbers and actually come to the conclusion of anything else. That even at the core, even inside a class analysis, there is race. There is a race component that cannot be denied. And the problem I think I have, and I'm not here to punch left, I'm actually here to punch right over at Mark Burns and conservatives who are forwarding this lie. But the only problem I have with leftists would be they feel as though class analysis is the apex of analyses, and that nothing else transcends a class analysis. And that's wrong. That's wrong in a material sense, and that's wrong in a practical, modern day sense. Historically, is wrong as well. It's equal. You absolutely cannot neglect the racial component, particularly in the United States, in this late stage of capitalism. You cannot neglect the role of racism any more than you can neglect the role of classism. And it seems like an argument that we have to have over and over and over again, because the jury apparently is still out for so many people. So many people where you have a grouping of people who would like nothing more than this to be about class. This is not where Mark Burns falls into. Mark Burns and his sycophant love for Donald Trump, he's doing this as a service to empire, to a service to Donald Trump. I won't even give him the credit of saying that this is to the service of capitalism. This is nothing more than his fanboy love affair for Donald Trump, period. But on the opposite side of the equation is the conversation that is ongoing in leftist circles, where some people feel like the apex of any type of analysis is the class analysis, to the neglect, to the detriment of a racial analysis. Just like you have people who say race is everything, and they say race is everything as an intentional tool to ignore a class analysis. And both of those extremes are extremely wrong. The reality of it is it's interwoven, it's interconnected. There's a nuanced connection and relationship between racism and classism in the United States of America. You cannot talk about class without discussing race as it pertains to class. And you can't talk about race without talking about how class pertains to it. In other words, you can't talk about blackness without talking about the varying degrees of blackness in terms of economic wealth and economic opportunity, income, as well as generational wealth that's passed down in black communities, which leaves a certain class of black people in a far more privileged situation than the lower class of black people. You can't talk about race without talking about class. But likewise, you can't talk about class generally and say everything in America boils down to late stage capitalism and race is just a useful tool to distract us. You can't talk about it in that regards because the data actually bears this out, that at the core of the economic disparity in the United States, it is concentrated disproportionately in black communities, and that is because of years of systemic injustices and economic exploitation at the hands of capitalism, which is why you can't leave out class. But here we go again, another year and another group of people. I'm not talking about Mark Burns at this point. I'm talking about people on the left who, and from the neoliberal center to the left, who want to make the conversation be about what they're comfortable talking about and what works for them economically, because we're all monsters in this capitalistic system. The reality of it is that the reason they want to only talk about class in one category is because that's what pays their bills. And the reason they only want to talk about race only in another category is because that's what pays their bills as well. And we're just here in the middle of those two extremes saying it's both and. All right, folks, have a wonderful day. For those of you who hang out with us at 4 o'clock, see you at 4 o'clock for the live show, Like It or Not, with Benjamin Dixon and Rebecca Azor. We will see you next time.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog, join the Progressive Army, and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. It's Ben Dixon! If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.
Consider becoming a Patreon. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show.